I want to take, ow! I want to take less ow! I want to take less damage, ow, my leg! Ladies, gentlemen, and monsters of all ages, we've spent quite a bit of time both testing and talking about various skills in Monster Hunter Wilds on this channel so far since release, but a lot of that attention has been spent and put into offensive skills and maximizing offense in various ways. But especially with the average hunt time in Wilds being relatively quite low, a lot of people are starting to accept that maybe they should work in some comfort, utility, or defense into their build instead of just going into 100% full offense, because it's just unnecessary. So today we're going to talk about defense in Monster Hunter in general and how it works and scales in Wilds, and then we'll talk about all the different defensive skills that are worth considering using on your armor or decoration slots and how they work, as well as when I would recommend considering their use for any of the more situational ones. First then we should talk about raw defense numbers. In Monster Hunter, raw defense works on a slightly depreciating scale, but the math for defense seems to be slightly different in Wilds than it has been in previous Monster Hunter games. To be specific for the people who like numbers in previous games, to work out your damage reduction, it was essentially a calculation of 80 divided by 80 plus your defense times 100, and that was the formula for working out percent damage reduction beforehand. However, that doesn't seem to be the case anymore, because at 80 defense you don't take 50% damage. You instead take 50% damage at around 120 defense now. To be specific, I did a lot of testing with this on the training dummy with as few variables as physically possible, and this is how hard the training dummy hits you when sent to maximum stars of damage. And when you have no armor on and a ranged weapon equipped as well, that is the base default number that we have here with 1 defense, as having a melee weapon equipped lowers physical damage taken, which would also muddy the results. So that hits hard, right? The first one? Well, if you wanted to cut that damage nearly perfectly in half, you would have to go up to 121 defense. At 121 defense, you take about 50% of the damage that you would have taken with 1 defense, or in other terms, you go up to around 200% effective health points, effective HP, because it takes twice as much damage to kill you as it would otherwise. That said, going up to 241 defense doesn't perfectly cut that in half again, because it's a scale. Here is 241 defense taking the exact same hit, and it's cut off about 35% of the damage taken from 121 defense. So it's less than half, bit more than a third, and you can see this here as the red health marker would be exactly 50% of the damage taken. So you can see the difference right there quite visibly, but we'll show some numbers a bit more later too. Then again, up to 479 defense, and it's clearly not quite half of the damage taken at 241 either. Again, more like a 35% reduction. All of these numbers are essentially to say that defense as a stat in Monster Hunter Wilds is important, it is a big deal, and at 479 defense, which is something that you wouldn't really get in a regular set, you have somewhere between 300 and 400% of the effective health points that you would at 1 defense. That said, it's also important to be aware of the scaling differences here. The amount of extra tankiness you get from the first 120 defense is way more than the tankiness you get from stacking another 120 defense. This doesn't mean that you shouldn't get defense over 120, it just means that defense gets less value per point the more of it you have. It is a depreciating value. At a certain point, stacking defense becomes less worth it because you need so much more of it to make an actual notable difference, and usually that point is right around when you get proper high rarity armor and then actually upgrade it with armor spheres as well, as just doing this will put you somewhere near 350 defense usually. And just for the sake of it, those were the test results I wanted to show next to each other, but I did test at different defense numbers too, the more standard ones in previous games. So here are all of the different tests that I did with this, all of the different times I got hit at different defense numbers, and the amount of damage that I took. So you can see the general scale of how damage will go down depending on these different defense numbers and these gaps, and these are pretty common sort of numbers that you will reach at different points in your Monster Hunter journey, with the exception of 479 being a very abnormal number. That's something that I pumped higher by using things like Hunting Horn Large Defense buff, but that should give you a general idea of how defense actually affects incoming damage taken at various points. And pretty much all of that is going to give you a general frame of reference as we dive into the actual defensive skills in the game, starting with, of course, defense boost itself. This gives you increased defenses, some flat defense, some percent defense increase, and some all element resistance depending on the actual rank. And these ranks do a good job of describing the actual numbers, which is nice too. That said, a more standard endgame set with upgraded armor will sit at around 320 to 350 defense generally, so at full 7 ranks, which is full 7 1-slot sockets of investment, performance, that's basically 20% defense and some all element resistance. The thing is, if you have more defense than that, it's actually worth less overall, though even then, if it was a 20% defense boost, it doesn't mean that you would take 20% less damage. That's why we went through the difference in defense stat increases from before. It would maybe be like 10% less damage on average on a good day, but of course that also means this does have more value the worse that your defense stat is to begin with. And generally speaking, there are skills that can give you more defensive benefit for less investment. The skill is fine, but it's definitely better at earlier stages of the game. I wouldn't really consider it in endgame unless you're really trying to specifically stack defense over everything else. Next up then is Divine Blessing. This gives you a 25% chance when taking damage to reduce the damage taken by 15% at rank 1, 30% at rank 2, and 50% at rank 3. This is a top tier defensive skill for two main reasons. For 3 ranks, this is essentially on average a 12.5% damage reduction over the course of a hunt. This is solid, of course, in itself compared to 3 ranks of defense boost, but then consider exactly how Divine Blessing works. Because it is a chance to trigger, but a large amount reduced when it happens, it's perfect for the style of modern Monster Hunter, where most dangerous attacks are about hitting for most of your health in one hit, and then following it up with something to finish you off. Sure, it won't trigger on every big hit, but when it does trigger on a big hit, it can easily be the difference between life and death when it does, and it also can be when it triggers on the secondary hit of a combo too, and those things together make this a pretty top tier defensive skill, considering it is only a 1-slot decoration for each rank as well. Next up then we have the various elemental resistance skills, like fire, water, thunder, dragon, and ice resistance. These increase your resistance stat to their element of choice by 6 at first rank, 12 at second rank, and then 20 at third rank, with a bonus 10 defense as well. It's worth noting here that you also become completely immune to an elemental blight at 20 resistance of its matching element. 20 fire resistance means that you can't get fire blight, 20 water resistance means a water blight, etc. For a sort of example of how resistances actually work, here is Arkveld's Major Dragon Explosion hitting a player with 0 dragon resistance, and then here is the exact same attack hitting a player with 50 dragon resistance, which is about as high as you can stack an elemental resistance in the game. That said, the difference here is about a 31% damage reduction, which is sort of disappointing for investing 50 resistance into an element resistance, but now you know. As for the status resistances, these reduce the duration of a status by 30% for the first rank, 60% for the second rank, and make you immune to the status at third rank, except for blast resistance, which instead increases the duration before the effect triggers and lowers the damage that it does for the first 2 ranks, and then makes you immune to third rank too. All of the elemental resistances and status resistances in general are good to use when against a specific monster that has that specific effect in large amounts. If you're going against a Lalabarina and you keep getting paralyzed, the solution to that is using paralysis resistance. It will make a major difference. But these are what I would label as niche defensive skills, situational skills. You won't need them most of the time against most monsters, you won't put them in your general use builds, but it's good to know that they exist in case you ever find the need to slot them in for a specific fight in the future, in case a specific monster gives you problems, or if something new is added to the game that's really tough and has one of these things. There's also Blight Resistance itself as a skill, which applies to all elemental blights, essentially a catch-all to negate blights. Adaptability is a skill, removes the hot or cold weather effect at first rank, and removes environmental damage at second rank. This affects things like standing in lava on the oilwell basin, and again this one is quite niche, but could have some applications, just not something I would recommend for general use for sure. After that we have a couple of healing based skills. Recovery Up increases the healing that you get from any and every source in the game, but it's worth noting that if you are using Hunting Horn, or if you're using the wide range skill, it does not increase the healing that other players get from you, but if they have Recovery Up themselves, they will still get increased numbers from this. Point being, this only affects the healing of the player that has the skill, but it does affect all sources of healing if you have it. First rank is a 10% increase in healing received, second rank is a 20% increase, and then third rank is a 30% increase. This may not sound like a lot, but consider how many times you drink a mega potion and still have some empty health left to fill, and consider how many potions you might save if you just healed 30% more with each of them. This is a high tier defensive skill, not in the sense that it prevents damage, but in the sense that it can help you get back on top of the situation after you get hit much easier, much quicker, and it increases your longevity before running out of supplies too in tougher fights. Then we have Recovery Speed. This increases the speed at which you recover red health. When you take damage in Monster Hunter, half of the damage that you take comes back as red health. This is recoverable over time unless you get hit again during the duration, in which case it disappears. Recovery Speed speeds up the healing from the specific process. Rank 1 is 200% speed, rank 2 is 300% speed, and rank 3 is 400% speed. This is definitely not bad by any means, but generally speaking, I'd say the two highest priority defense skills are Divine Blessing and Recovery Up, so it is competing with some pretty heavy defensive options. Then we have Heroics, which is also worth mentioning. When you go under 35% health, you gain 50 defense for the first 2 ranks, 100 defense for the next 2 ranks, and then no defense at all for maximum rank because it's also an attack increasing skill. Usually the use case for Heroics as a skill is the offensive portion of it, and mostly this is for speedrunners, but it's worth mentioning that it exists for defensive purposes too. Gaining 100 defense when you go under 35% health isn't that bad in itself, but it's worth noting this is especially good early game. If you can get yourself a few ranks of Heroics early game when you have low flat defense stat, this amount of actual bonus flat defense is worth a lot and can save you from dying if you are finding trouble earlier on. But at the cost of 3 2-slot sockets to get to 100 defense gain in the end game, it won't save you enough to actually be worth the actual value. Again, this is one that's better early game than late game, at least for defense, and then it will become very relevant for speedrunning purposes in the proper end game. Then we have 2 more interesting skills here, starting with Evade Window, and shout out to Michael MH here for doing extensive tests on iframes using paratodes, which is quite a smart way of doing it. With 60 frames per second, the base evade has 15 frames of invulnerability, meaning for 1/4 of a second, you are immune to damage when you evade by default. Evade Window 1 brings us up to 17 frames, Evade Window 2 up to 19 frames, Evade Window 3 up to 21 frames, Evade Window 4 to 24 frames, and then Evade Window 5 to 28 frames. The last 2 ranks are the biggest increases, and this shows that you get nearly double the iframes with full evade window that you would have without any evade window at all. And again, with the test being done at 60 FPS, this means 5 evade window is almost a half second of invulnerability when you roll. For a bit of extra information, to my knowledge, this does stack with food buffs, but to the same cap of 28 frames. Tumbler Meal Low is the equivalent of Evade Window 2. Tumbler Meal High is the equivalent of Evade Window 3, but if you mix and match these food skills with varying levels of Evade Window, they will still cap out at 28 frames, which is a total of 5 ranks equivalent of Evade Window with 60 FPS. So there are multiple ways of putting these things together, but a limit to how much they can increase your iframes. Overall, I'd say Evade Window is a really good skill in Wilds, and in fact, especially for weapons with inbuilt evasion attacks, as it affects those too, and the extra good part of this is it comes on Gore Magala armor for free for a lot of builds because Gore Magala armor is meta offense in a lot of slots, but outside of that, it is a 2-slot decoration, which does mean it's competing with a lot of offensive options at that point as well. So generally, I recommend a bit of Evade Window from skills and finish the rest off with food buffs if you like Evade Window. As for Evade Extender, this one is simpler and it's unfortunate. It increases the distance of any evading actions, meaning the roll itself, but again, any weapon actions that count as evades and have iframes too, like Sword and Shield backstep, Hammer Charge Step, those types of things, and preliminary testing shows this one has very small effect compared to the previous game, because in Monster Hunter Rise and Sunbreak, Evade Extender increased your evade distance by up to 100% at full ranks. It literally doubled it, but in Wild, it seems to be back to the lower version of this effect from World and Iceborne, which is about 10% increased distance per rank. So 10%, then 20%, and then 30% increased distance at maximum ranks. It's not great right now compared to how it's been in the past, and so generally I don't recommend Evade Extender unless you're just someone who really enjoys it, in which case do whatever you want. Next up then we have Earplugs, and this is a super undervalued skill in Wilds right now. You can look in the Monster Field Guide to see the special attacks of each monster, and these generally apply to things like statuses they can do, elements they can do, the amount of tremor that they can cause, the amount of wind pressure, stuff like that, which is really nice to know for these more niche defensive skills. But in Wilds, this also shows you the roar power that a monster has. Anything listed as a weak roar can be ignored with level 2 of the Earplugs skill. This is actually quite easy to get, and the only things with roars stronger than this by default are Gore Magala, Jin Dahaad, Gravios, and the final boss who only exists in low rank anyways. So that's 3 monsters that you might encounter in high rank. There are some slight exceptions, like I believe Duna goes to a strong roar, specifically when enraging and no other time in the fight, but this means in the vast majority of actual hunts right now in endgame Monster Hunter Wilds, Earplugs level 2 is enough to ignore roars. 2 ranks of Earplugs is arguably worth it for what that gives you, as monsters will roar multiple times in a fight, and every roar that you ignore is time that you could be using to heal if you are injured, sharpen if you need to sharpen, or of course just damage the monster itself. So I'm a really big fan of Earplugs right now in Wilds, especially at rank 2, and a little bonus note here for Insect Glaive players, you only need 1 rank of Earplugs for this effect, because when you have all 3 of your extracts, you get 1 rank of Earplugs naturally as well as a bonus. Then we have some more niche skills, so I won't call out everything, but importantly I do want to mention Shock Absorber, which removes flinches from or to other players. And I just think this is fantastic for multiplayer. Everyone should use it for multiplayer. It doesn't matter in solo, obviously, because it won't have an effect, but it is unbelievably comfortable in multiplayer to have this on. And I think if you don't use it in multiplayer, you're only really hurting yourself and possibly even your other hunters. There's a misconception as well going around that this skill makes it so you cannot help other hunters that are stunned or frozen or stuff like that, and this is incorrect. In wilds, that only happens if the hunter that is in trouble has the flinch free skill, not Shock Absorber. Shock Absorber is different and will only stop negative ally flinching at the cost of a single 1-slot decoration socket, so that's pretty useful. Then we have a couple of group bonuses worth mentioning too. Fortifying Pelt gives you increased attack and defense when you faint on a quest, with a 10% increase to both of those stats after your first feint, and a 15% increase to both stats after your second feint. Guardian's Protection only takes effect on the Runes of Wyvria map, but this group bonus gives you 10% damage reduction from elemental or unique damage in the Runes of Wyvria, with unique damage here referring to things like the Wilk explosions specifically. Then a couple of defensive set bonuses to round things off too. Gravios' Protection gives you a damage reduction when you're at full health. Specifically, this would potentially be good if there were survivable one-shots in wild, but right now with proper defense on an endgame set, you just won't get one-shot by anything except like dahaad's super attack, and Gravios' set won't make the difference there at all. The 2-set bonus decreases damage taken when at full health by 5%, and the 4-set bonus by 10%, but this is sort of made bad to begin with by being lower rarity armor than the highest rarity options, as this means that its defense cap is lower than just using higher rarity armor as well, so its bonus is made pretty irrelevant in the current state of the game. Then finally, Duna's Cover, the Duna set bonus. This gives you 25 bonus defense while you're wearing a mantle with the 2-set bonus, and then 50 defense and 12 all-elemental resistance for the 4-set bonus too. This is actually a pretty solid defensive set bonus, but currently Tool Specialist isn't working properly, which means you can't really build around mantle uptime, and so this set bonus as well, while neat in theory, isn't that great when you consider that you'd have to fully invest in Duna armor to make it work. It's something that you could do, but it's definitely not good per se. To sort of round up things that I think are properly worth considering then, for defensive and utility increases from armor skills, you want to properly upgrade your armor and get all the defense that you can, because the difference that defense makes is pretty massive, but that doesn't mean you want to overinvest in defense from skills, because it does have diminishing returns after a certain point. For example, fully upgraded rarity 7 armor will have less defense than fully upgraded rarity 8 armor, but you've already reached the point where that's not that big of a difference in the end, so use what you actually want for the skills. As for skills then, Divine Blessing is top tier, Recovery Up I would say is second to Divine Blessing, and that's how I would prioritize 1-slot sockets for defensive skills. Evade Window is quite good if you're someone who wants to do more iframe evading instead of positional evading. There are multiple weapons that benefit greatly from it due to having inbuilt evade attacks, and it also works great with things like the Adrenaline Rush damage skill, so I would say 2 or 3 ranks of Evade Window is pretty solid for most people, but if 5 ranks makes you feel more comfortable while playing, go for it. The less time that you spend getting hit by the monster, the more damage you will do. Evade Extender, in comparison, is pretty disappointing in Wilds, which I feel the need to mention because it was quite good in Rise and Sunbreak, but Earplugs is quite the opposite because it's very good right now. If you have the space and don't have a competing skill, it is very, very good to get 2 ranks of Earplugs in Wild specifically, and then if you're doing multiplayer hunts, find a space for Shock Absorber to reduce ally flinches. Otherwise, pretty much everything else isn't really worth talking about and thinking about using, I would say. That pretty much does it for today then, everyone. A deeper dive on the damage reductions from defense in Wilds, as well as the actual effectiveness of various defensive and utility skills, and which ones I think are actually worth grabbing and using in Monster Hunter Wilds. I hope you've all enjoyed this then, and hopefully it helps you all out too. Like if you liked the video, subscribe to the notification bell for more, and most importantly, ladies and gentlemen, until next time, stay sweet.
Josh, Cotton, and Hollow with the videos, dropping the humor like a hammer on your tippy toes, bringing entertainment on a daily arrangement to take our insanity and turn it into entertainment. Yes, I said entertainment twice, to reiterate that it is nice to look into your faces on a mostly daily basis when you let us in your homes to make the whole world a stage. Goodbye.